started here, we're going to be talking about the root Locus design method. So how we're going to start this is I'm going to motivate what we're doing. Okay, so here's the basic idea. We start with a plant that we want to control. For us, we've been using this DC motor for now. And for control, this is the type of feedback loop we've been looking at. This is called a unitary feedback loop, the one that we've been using. The reason it's called that is sometimes you can have another transfer function down here within the feedback loop. Like a good example is you have this output coming off of your plant and you measure it with a sensor. But what if that measurement is noisy? You might want to pass it through a low pass filter, something to clean up that noise a little bit. So that's just an example of something that might be in that feedback loop. But for us, we don't have anything down here. So, I mean, you could imagine that being a transfer function with just a 1 in it. And that's why we would call it unitary. It's like nothing's there. So, anyways, that's just a little more detail about the specific feedback loop we've been using in the class. So this loop, you can condense it. So you see like the reference coming in on the left-hand side. That's what we want the output to be doing. Over here we have the actual output. So you can condense this feedback loop, and we've actually already done this already, into the closed loop transfer function. And so we derived that a couple class periods ago. So whenever you see this feedback loop, you could just say, well, basically it's this closed loop transfer function that relates the reference to the output over here. All right. So here is the big deal. The poles of the closed loop transfer function, these are going to dictate the transient performance. So we're talking about settling time, overshoot, rise time, peak time, etc. And as control systems engineers, we're trying to make closed loop systems that meet these performance specifications. And so it all comes back to the poles. All right. There's one other thing you need to keep in mind. So these are transient performance. They're like as you're transitioning to following the reference. For steady state performance, so this is talking about if you let your controller just run for a little bit of time, is the output actually going to follow the reference? And so we discovered you need at least one open loop pole at z equals, anybody? If you want to have zero steady state error when tracking specific references, there we go. The digital controls freak, Zach. Okay, good. Good. So you need at least one pole at z equals 1 if you want steady state error to be 0 when tracking a step reference. If you want to perfectly track a ramp reference, you need 2 open loop poles at z equals 1, z for zebra, that's right. And if you want to track a quadratic reference, you would need 3 open loop poles at z equals 1. So when we're designing a control system, we're worried about steady state performance, like how does it perform in the long term, and also short term, like transient performance. Okay, So this we're all familiar with. Now for the DC motor, this is the most recent controller we developed. There's a control gain divided by z minus 1. So we added this pole at z minus 1 to give us that steady state performance that we wanted. So that's what I'm saying right here. This achieves 0 steady state error for a step response. We've seen it in action. It works. And then depending on how you choose the control gain K, you can achieve different closed loop poles. And remember, closed loop poles dictate the transient performance. So here's where we're kind of getting to the root locus. So for this particular control system, remember the root locus is just a graph of all possible locations of your closed loop poles as you change your control gain. So actually the root locus, maybe if I colored this in a little bolder, these are the poles for your closed loop system when K equals 0. And we know as we increase K, well, this pole moves this way, this pole moves this way. Eventually they meet together, and then they grow apart once more, and they move along this path. And so, like last time, we pointed out different values of K along this line, and those different closed loop poles give different performance. Like, I think somewhere along here, K was like 0.09, and this gave us an overshoot of like 25%, for example. Oh, that went behind my head. Zach says, regarding the open loop pole at z equals 1 on 2b in the homework ramp reference, there was a z minus 1 in the numerator for the equation when we solve for kv. Would this not always evaluate to 0, meaning that the error would be 1 over 0, which is infinity? Zach, you're onto something there. You're onto something there. Remember, you need at least one open loop pole at z equals 1. And that means, well, if you have one open loop pole at z equals 1, that means you're a type 1 system. And remember, we made a table in class. If you're only a type 1 system, you have infinite steady state error when tracking a ramp reference. You can't do it with a type 1. With a type 2, or wait. No, if you have type 1, you don't have infinite error. You have, if you're type 1, you have like some finite error. If you're type 0, you have infinite error for a ramp. So in your homework, pay attention to what system type you have. Is it type 1? Is it type 0? I don't know. Okay. Here's the question. What if I want closed loop poles in a location that's not offered by this specific root locus? Here's what I mean. So here's the same figure down below. And remember, if I change my gain K, my closed loop poles can be anywhere on this root locus. But what if I want poles in a place that's not offered by the root locus? So like, for example, what if I want closed loop poles like here? Let's try to make this symmetrical on the other side. Those two closed loop poles are not on that root locus. There's no value of K that I can provide that'll make the root locus pass through these points. So what do you do then? Zach says, but if z equals 1, then it would always be infinity. Does the z value differ based on the type? Oh, I know what you're saying, Zach. There's like a z minus 1, but that z minus 1 cancels with something in the open loop transfer function. If the open loop transfer function has an open loop pole at z equals 1. I'd have to show you for you to see it. But you see that z minus 1 that you're talking about. It multiplies the open loop transfer function. Okay, so the root locus design method is a technique to make the root locus pass through whatever, wait, I can't spell whatever, closed loop poles that you choose. And that's kind of why we call it the root locus design method. We're actually going to reconstruct where the root locus goes, what its shape looks like to suit our needs. So, which is cool. But to see how that works, we're going to reverse engineer the root locus. Jean-Claude says, control the world. That's right. As Mook, our beloved Joe Mook, as he would say, we're out to control the world. Okay, so what we're going to do, this is our starting point. Don't trigger my PTSD from Mook, says Wilcox. Okay, so we start with the closed loop transfer function. So what the closed loop poles are the values of z that do what? This is a question for the audience. So we have a closed loop transfer function. So the closed loop poles are the values of z that what? Fill in the blank. Yes, make infinity. That make g closed loop of z evaluate to infinity. Yeah, Raichu says make denominator 0. That's correct. Wait, evaluate to infinity. When are we going to get an Estes Burge podcast? I'll reach out to him. We'll make it happen. So this is just the definition of poles. Remember, poles make a transfer function evaluate to infinity. And this happens when, so if you look at this, we can make this evaluate to infinity if we have this condition satisfied. 1 plus gz times dz equals 0. Because then we'd be dividing by 0. It would be infinite. Okay. So, closed loop poles satisfy this equation. If I plug a value of z into this equation and this evaluates to 0, then it is a closed loop pole. And this is called the closed loop characteristic equation. Because remember, the roots of the characteristic equation are called the poles. The characteristic equation describes all the characteristics of a system. So this is a super important equation. All right. So this is going to be working towards the root locus. You'll see. We can rewrite this characteristic equation as, and this is just a simple manipulation, g of z times d of z equals minus 1. So I just move the 1 over to the other side. All right. So, if you plug an arbitrary value of z into the open loop transfer function, which is g times d, it's not going to evaluate to minus 1. It's only going to evaluate to minus 1 if z is a closed loop pole. I know I might be sounding like a broken record, but this is building the argument. It's not going to evaluate to minus 1 for just any value of z. Only if z is a closed loop pole. So in general, if you just plug in some value of z, g of z is going to evaluate to a complex number. Generally. So let's say I plug in some random value of z, and g of z times d of z evaluates to this complex number, a plus bi. And I want to express this number in terms of magnitude and phase. So we're going to go to the complex plane, and I'm just throwing this number in the complex plane. How I Miss Dr. Estes says P 4286. That's Phil. Hey, welcome back, Phil. Okay, so we throw this in the complex plane. So what is the magnitude? The magnitude is the distance from the origin. So let's draw that in there. So this distance is the magnitude, which we indicate just by these double straight bars. Hey, thanks for stopping by. Okay, and so we could put like this, the imaginary part is B, the real part is A. All right, so the magnitude, if you calculated it, it would be square root of A squared plus B squared. Okay, the phase, we're familiar with this. If you draw just a ray from the origin through that complex number, and then if you find the angle from the positive real axis to that ray, going counterclockwise, this is the phase. Okay? So if we just plug like some value of z into the open loop transfer function, it'll evaluate generally to a complex number, and we could break that complex number into magnitude and phase. But what happens in the special case where we plug in a closed loop pole? Okay, so we're going to do the same thing, but this is the special case. This is not just going to be any value of z. We're going to substitute a closed loop pole in there. Remember, when you substitute a closed loop pole into the open loop transfer function, you get this. G of z times d of z equals -1. So if we throw that in the complex plane, well, it's right here. It's on the negative real axis at -1. Let's get the magnitude and phase. So once again, the magnitude is just the distance of this number from the origin. So that distance is 1. Okay, now another question for you. What is the phase? What is the phase in the special case when you evaluate this at a closed loop pole? Pi. Beautiful. 180 degrees. So we go from the positive real axis over to a ray from the origin through that point. So the angle is pi. Okay. So, and this is like the beginning of the root locus design technique, because we have two criteria here that a closed loop pole needs to satisfy. The magnitude criterion and the phase criterion. Okay, so we have two criteria here. So, if, let's say z star, whatever that might be, if it's a closed loop pole of our closed loop transfer function, it must satisfy these two conditions. How do you calculate the angle if it's not on an axis? That's a great question, and we will get into that because I have an example in a second here. Okay, so if you're a closed loop pole, you must satisfy what we call the magnitude criterion, meaning that if I plug that value of z into the open loop transfer function, take the magnitude, it has to be equal to 1. Then if you take the angle that it makes, it has to be pi. That's the magnitude criterion and phase criterion. This is what the whole root locus design technique is based on. Pog example, yes. Okay, so let's do a really quick walkthrough of the root locus design method, and then we'll get into an example which we might not finish, but we'll at least start it. So we have these two criteria. Here is the root locus design method in a nutshell. Here's the starting point. You're going to, when you design a control system, you're going to have some desired closed loop poles in mind. And remember, like, we spent the first third of the class thinking about, if I'm given some settling time, overshoot, rise time, like, what are the closed loop poles that give me those behaviors? So we know how to go from performance criteria to discrete time closed loop poles. Okay, so let's just take that for granted. Say I know what closed loop poles I want to achieve. So the root locus method assumes a general form for the controller. So this is the most generic form. You have a control gain, and then you multiply this by something that looks like this. Your controller might have a bunch of zeros. So these are roots of the numerator. I'm just going to go up to like Z, M, I guess. So it doesn't mean that your controller always has this many zeros. We want to make our controllers as simple as possible, but this is just the general form. It's also going to have some poles. So in general, let's just say it could have up to N poles. So we at least know, hey, it could be of this form. So that's your starting point. Now, we're going to choose how many zeros we have and where they are. And same with the poles. We're going to choose the poles, how many poles we're going to have, where we're going to put them, such that the angle criterion is satisfied. So remember, there's two criterion that a root needs to satisfy if it's a closed loop pole. So if we want our closed loop poles to be Z star, they're going to have to satisfy those two criteria. We're going to design this controller to make sure that those closed loop poles meet those criteria. So the first step of the root locus process is we have to choose the zeros and the poles so that the angle criterion is satisfied when Z equals Z star. So remember, this is the angle criterion. Here's going to be our guiding principles. If you add a 0 to d of z, so like I said, you're going to decide how many zeros you have in the numerator, how many poles you have in the denominator, like what do those actually do? So adding a 0 increases this phase. So let's say like your phase is under where it needs to be. If you need to increase it to bring it up to pi, adding a 0 is a way to increase the angle. All right. Adding a pole does the opposite thing. It decreases that angle. So let's say your angle is greater than pi. Well, if I add a pole to d of z, that is going to have the effect of bringing that angle back down towards pi. So adding zeros and poles is a way to dial in the angle criterion. All right, so we have that. Here's another thing you have to keep in mind. The number of poles in your controller must be greater than or equal to the number of zeros in your controller. So if you have 1 0, 1 pole in your controller, you're okay. If you have 2 zeros, 1 pole, you're not okay. The number of poles must be greater than or equal in order for the controller to be causal. What I mean by that is causal, like cause and effect. It turns out if you have more zeros than you have poles, your controller depends on information from the future, which you will never have in real life. It just doesn't work. Maybe we'll do an example where you can prove it for yourself. If you just make up a controller that has more zeros than poles, if you convert it back to a difference equation, you'll see that your control input will depend on error from the future, which you won't have. Okay, so it's just, you could make a controller like that in theory, but you can't implement it because we don't exist in the future and the present. We're not like Doctor Strange or something. Okay, the last thing. Keeping steady state error in mind, D of Z may require a pole or more than one pole at Z equals 1, as we know. Mru 007 says your controller shouldn't be paracausal, paranormal, a ghostly controller. Okay. So, remember, we have some closed loop poles in mind. We're designing a controller so that our closed loop poles coincide with where we want them to be. So, we have to first satisfy the angle criterion. But, okay, step 4. We still have the magnitude criterion. You have to choose, so this is where the controller gain comes in. We're going to choose the gain so that the magnitude criterion is satisfied. So this is the magnitude criterion. You take the magnitude of the open loop transfer function, evaluate it at Z star, it should be 1. So here's a guiding principle for that. This is a little more straightforward. Increasing the gain K increases your magnitude. So if your magnitude is too small, you increase the gain until the magnitude equals 1. Okay, so we're going to get into an example to help this make more sense. Okay, so here's our example. Why is it in terms of Z star? Because we're plugging in Z star, our desired closed loop pole. Okay, here's our example. Let's say our plant that we want to control is just first order, and it's given by this simple transfer function. Remember, the plant transfer function relates the output y to the control input u. All right, and we're going to do our same unity feedback loop, and we don't know what our controller is going to be yet, but I want closed loop poles at, let's call it Z star equals 0.4 plus or minus 0.4 I. So this will give me some complex conjugate closed loop poles that meet some performance criteria. Oops. All right, so our closed loop transfer function, remember, it just looks like G of Z times D of Z 1 plus g of z times d of z. Is that a 0.9 or a 0.4? It's a 4. It's a 4. All right. So the controller, we're going to assume it's of this form. Some gain times z minus z1, z minus z2. I'm not saying we'll have this many zeros, but this is just like the general form. This is just your starting point for the root locus, and we're going to have some poles. I don't know how many poles yet, how many zeros. We'll just start here. So the first thing we want to do is design d of z so that we satisfy the angle criterion. All right, so we need the angle of the open loop transfer function evaluated at z star to be equal to pi. That's the only way that z star can be one of our closed loop poles. So I'm going to show you a little trick here. If you have two complex numbers, so I mean g of z is evaluated at z star, is generally a complex number. Same thing with our controller. If you take the angle contribution or the phase angle of the product of those, it's the same as the phase angle of each of them taken independently and added together. And so we know this should add up to pi. So this gives us some information about our controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract the angle of our plant from both sides. And this is going to give us the phase angle that our controller needs to create. It's going to be pi minus the angle contribution from the plant. So if this number is positive, so if d of z needs to contribute a positive phase angle, we're going to add a 0 to the controller, because remember, having a 0 in your controller adds phase. If this is less than 0, we're going to add a pole, because having a pole in your controller decreases the phase. So this is helping us decide the form of our controller. Does it need a 0? Does it need a pole? Does it need a couple? So on. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to calculate the phase angle of the plant evaluated at z star. I'm going to show you 3 ways to do this. The first way is the long way. Okay. But this way will make a lot of sense. Okay, evaluate g at z star. So we're going to take g, which is 1 over z minus 0.8, but we're going to evaluate it at z star, and we're going to take the angle. My controller has A, B, X, Y, can't find 0. Wow, Corey. Wow. Okay, so let's plug in z star. So remember, that was, I'm just going to plug in the positive conjugate here. So 0.4 plus 0.4i, that's the positive conjugate of z star. And then we subtract minus 0.8. And we're going to take the angle of this. So let's just keep rolling with the math here. This is 1 over minus 0.4 plus 0.4i. So I just subtracted the, where's the 0.8 come from? It comes from the plant. Okay. And then what I'm going to do to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to multiply this by the conjugate the only reason I'm multiplying by this is we have a complex number in the denominator. Really, I just want to turn this into a regular complex number like a plus b times I. So if you do this, it's going to get rid of the complex number in the denominator. So I'm going to have minus 0.4 minus 0.4i in the numerator. And the denominator is going to be minus 0.4 squared plus 0.4 squared. So this will just evaluate to a real number. And if you go through the math, you're going to get minus 1.25 minus 1.25i. So where did the 0.8 go? Oh, okay, because I had 0.4 minus 0.8, and then it went into minus 0.4. That's where it went. Okay, so remember the definition of the phase angle. You have the complex plane, so imaginary axis, real axis, and I'm going to throw this complex number into the complex plane. Let's say it's over here. So this is g of z times d of z, or no, this is just g of z, sorry. Minus 1.25 minus 1.25i. So I'm going to draw a ray from the origin through this point. The easy stuff has become difficult. Wait, don't worry, this is okay. And then the phase angle, you just go from the positive real axis counterclockwise all the way around. And this turns out to be 135 degrees, or we like to stick with radians, 5 pi over 4 radians. Okay, so all we did, we plugged in Z star into G. You think it's 225? Oh, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. This is definitely not 135 degrees, because we're greater than 180. Wouldn't 130, yeah. Okay, sorry. So it's 180 plus 45, 225 degrees. Thank you, guys. Okay, so 5 pi over 4, that one's still right. Okay, this is the way I wanted to show you first. Whoa, where did it go? Because a phase angle is just, you take a complex number, then you take the angle. The second way I'm going to show you is in MATLAB. It's a faster way, obviously. But I wanted to show you this first to get a physical intuition for the phase angle. I'm going to jump over to MATLAB really quick. Over here. So I'm going to make this transfer function g. Oh, you know what? I didn't put a sampling period for our transfer function. This is important for discrete time systems. Let's just make something up. Let's say our sampling period is like 0.1 seconds or something. Okay, so we have that. I'm going to make a transfer function. It's 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8. JFK says that was a nice transition. Thank you very much. Thank you. And then we put our sampling period at the end just to say it's a discrete time. Oh, wait, what did I do? Oh, it shouldn't be minus 0.8. It's comma minus 0.8. Will I upload the code? Sure. But this will be a very short code, by the way. So all I'm doing, I made this transfer function in MATLAB. Now let's make z star. And I'm just going to do the positive conjugate. So you can evaluate the transfer function at z star using this command, eval fr. I think fr stands for frequency response, which isn't super relevant here, but you take the transfer function and you evaluate it at z star, and boom. This is the same complex number that we calculated by doing that math. If you want to get the phase angle, you just use the command angle. And so I'll do like angle of, what was t? T was 0.1. Actually, t won't affect the phase angle, but I just put that there for completeness. So let's take the angle. Okay, so this is in radians, by the way. And it gave us minus 2.3562. So we had, our angle was 5 times pi divided by 4. So you might be like, these two are different, but really these represent the same angle. They're the same. Yeah, it's just 3.9 radians is the same as minus 2.3. Like if you add these up, they'll add up to 2 pi. 2.3562, yeah. Yeah. So it's the same angle. All right. So this is another way to calculate the phase angle. Let's go back. Because I said I wanted to show you a third way. So I'm going to show you this third way really quick. And you might be like, why does there have to be a third way if MATLAB does this so quickly and so easily? Good point, but this third way is going to help us in a second. MATLAB is expensive. That's also true. Okay, this is a graphical way to calculate this phase angle in an easier way. Okay, so I'll call this like easy graphical technique. Will probably be a surefire investment on my personal computer in the future either way. It's good to have MATLAB, but it is expensive. Okay, easy graphical technique. So first, we're going to start with the complex plane once again. And step 1 is place z star in the complex plane. So for this, it was 0.4 plus or minus 0.4i, and I'm just putting the positive conjugate. Okay, so I placed it in the complex plane. Okay, next, place the pole or 0 you are taking the phase angle with respect to. The way I'm writing this right now, sorry, I just flew away. I don't really like my phrasing of saying this, but as I do this, I hope that it becomes clear. So this is what I mean. G of z is 1 over z minus 0.8. So z minus 0.8, this has a pole. This has a pole at 0.8. And so we're going to place this pole in the complex plane. So this is what I mean. So this is the pole of G of Z. I'm out of the room to write, so what should I do? Get a new sheet of paper. That sounds like a good solution. Okay, so here's step 3. Draw a ray from the pole that we just placed to Z star. So we're just going to draw a ray from right here up through Z star. All right, so that's step 3. Step 4, calculate angle from the positive real axis counterclockwise to that ray. Oops. Counterclockwise to this ray that we just drew. So we'll go from the positive real axis counterclockwise all the way to this ray. And you could use trig to calculate this angle. This is, this one actually is 135 degrees. Okay, this one actually is. Okay, the last step. If taking the angle with respect to a pole, like we are in this case, take the negative of this angle and then if taking the angle with respect to a 0, take the positive of the angle. This isn't relevant to us right now because we're doing a pole, but in general, we'll also be doing this with zeros. So following these steps, we got 135 degrees, but we were taking this angle with respect to a pole of a transfer function. So this graphical technique gives us the angle of the plant evaluated at Z star is minus 135 degrees or minus 135 would be minus 3 pi over 4, right? Minus, okay. But this is the same angle as 5 pi over 4. Right? So this gives us the angle that we've gotten with the other two methods. Okay, the first method was just you plug everything in, you get down to a complex number, and then you use the definition of the phase angle to get that angle. Method 2 is just plug stuff into MATLAB, use the angle command. Method 3, this one is a faster way to get the angle by hand, but we're going to use this technique to write some equations that we can automate that will become relevant later. So I know I'm not motivating this third technique as convincingly at this point, but you'll see even in this example that this becomes a useful way of getting the angle that we'll use. And we'll even use this technique, and we'll write some code to do this in MATLAB and automate it. I know we're running over in time. Just to put some closure on this. Why were we calculating the angle of G in the first place? So let's just go back here really quick. Yes, right here. We needed to figure out what does the angle contribution of our controller need to be so that we satisfy the angle criterion. So what we can do is, now that we have the angle of G of Z, which was 5 pi over 4, that means the angle of D of Z is minus pi over 4. What does this tell us about the form of controller that we need for D of Z? Any takers? It means D of Z needs to at least have a pole in it. So I know that D of Z at the minimum, maybe it doesn't have any zeros. So I have like just a control gain, and then I have 1 over Z minus P1 or something. This controller will contribute a negative angle. It's capable of that. And if I choose P1 to be in the right place, it'll contribute minus pi over 4. And then we'll satisfy the angle criterion. So that'll be the next step of this example. We know we need to add a pole to get a negative angle contribution. So then the question is, where should the pole be? And it's actually the third technique for doing an angle that we showed that will be the most useful for figuring out where that pole needs to be to satisfy that angle. And that wraps it up for today, everybody. I just wanted to introduce you to the method, get a head start on it, and do an example.